All right, welcome back. So what we're going to do, we're here in the library module. We're in loop view, as you can see, one large image. It's not a grid. Got the film strip down at the bottom. I'm going to tap the letter D for develop. We're going to go into the develop module for the first time, really. As you can see, it kind of looks very, very similar. Over here on the left side, we have collections. It's just closed up. We have something called history. And what history is every time we have a state change. We change something in the image, the lightness, darkness, have a brush, change the color. Something that changes the image will be recorded in this history panel. It does not record zooming. So as you can see, I just zoomed and it's not recording that. So if I change the exposure, then it pops in over here. It says exposure. So that's how it kind of works. And I can actually remove, oops, don't want to remove. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here to this side and I'm going to double click on the word exposure because that's what I changed. And so if I double click on the word, it resets the slider to its default position, which is in the center for all of these various sliders over here. And I'm in the basic tab, as you can see, basic tab. All right, so that's what the history does. If I click down at the bottom of the history, then it goes back to the very beginning point, but also watch the navigator. As I hover over a change, it shows me that preview of that history state of what was done. So it's pretty fascinating how this works. Snapshots are a way of kind of remembering as you build an image. You can create snapshots just by clicking on the plus sign. Presets, a certain amount of presets come in with um, Photoshop, Lightroom. And as you can see, I have some user presets that I've made in the past. And so just some different things. There's some sharpening ones and so forth. So we'll get into how to make the user ones. And as you saw, if you hover over it, it actually updates not only in the navigator window, but also in our main screen, which is really cool. There's a couple of places that Adobe has done this. And so it makes it so much easier for us to be able to decide, well, maybe these presets are something that I do want to do. Today, uh, since I'm talking about them, a preset sets the sliders for us. And tone curve, HSL over here, we have split toning, detailed. So it sets all these sliders for us. So, but they're changeable. So if you kind of like this look, but you want to tweak it some more, you can, which is what's really great about it. So, and there are some interesting ones depending on the image. So those are presets. I'm gonna keep those closed for right now. Coming over to along the bottom, we have the name of the file for the one that's highlighted, but as you roll over the different images in the film strip, it actually updates the name of that file that you're hovering over. That's also true in the library module. Coming over here, we have what's called a histogram. And so it shows us the various tones we have in the image, and we can actually make changes. Because hopefully you can see, this is 4K, so you can go full screen on it, and so you can see it. But right over here, and in the histogram, see how it's a little bit lighter where my cursor is? Well, the same thing is true down below in this area. And so as I come to highlights and shadows, or the sliders themselves, you can see that it changes and it shows you visually where those tones are in the histogram. So you can change them within there. You can click and change if you watch down below inside the histogram, or I can click and drag down here on the slider panel. So I'm going to start over again because I'm just showing you some things that's possible. Also, when you're in the image, you have underneath the histogram, you have the ISO, the focal length of the lens, the f-stop, and the shutter speed. If I hover inside, then it changes to RGB values. So it gives you a reading of RGB. My preference is lab mode. And what I do is I bring my cursor inside the histogram window. I right click and I go all the way to the bottom and say show color values. So this way when I'm over here, I look at the L value and that tells me the brightness right there because I print a lot. So it tells me when it starts to blow out and things. Um, where, where, it, where it's called clipping. So these boxes right up here, hopefully you can see where I'm clicking. When it's on, it shows here when these blacks are plugged up. So blacks is called plugging, and I'm gonna come back over here and turn on the white one. So it's both of them have a little screen on. You can see here this is called clipping. So it goes outside the range of our image area that Lightroom can handle. So the the range inside the histogram is 256 tones. And the height of these spikes is how many tones have that brightness. So as you can see, there's a lot of brightness on the right side. The spike goes all the way up to the top, nearly, and all the way to the right and to the left. So that's what the histogram does. It tries to keep us in bounds. So if we keep these two sliders on, then we know we're staying inside our range. And we may not worry about these because that's a little bitty area. You know, nobody's ever going to see that. I don't really care if I have detail in a print, and this is a tiny, tiny area as well. So, and it's inside the image area surrounded by lighter tones, so that may never be noticed either. So I'm going to turn off those for right now. Coming down the way, we have some tools, and we're going to get these later. We're going to skip over them for right now. Then we have color or black and white. This is where I can change it into black and white if I wanted to. It may not be the best way, but it is a way. I'm going to back up again on the history state. Now down below that is a profile section. If I click on it, then these are some newer ones that Adobe's made, and I must say they're quite good. Uh, here's a landscape profile. So what it's doing is changing color and saturation a little bit. If I wanted to do a portrait, then it's a softer look, a less contrast, less saturation would be a portrait one. Adobe Vivid where it'd be the most vivid for saturation and colors. Here's the monochrome again, where we can come into here, but it's built in as a profile. I find most of the time Adobe Standard or Color will really work well for you, but if you do a lot of people, you may want to set up a preset for portrait, and we can do that, and we'll get to that. Then over to the right of that, we have two columns, two squares, two columns, two rows of squares. And if I click on this, it opens up a profile browser. So here's the ones we just had. And now when I hover over them, it updates the window just like what you're seeing here, just like what you saw with the presets. So now you don't have to click on them. All you have to do is hover on them. But there's even more in here. There's a new section or a section called Adobe Raw, which is the legacy version of these. So for me, I like the newer versions, so I really don't look here too much. So I'll stay up here with these Adobes, the newer versions. Excuse me. Camera matching. Adobe has built some profiles, some looks that are based on, in my case, Canon's raw processing. And so that way if people are using it and they like those looks, Adobe has created something to come close to. Then what I have here are profiles, and there's two of them. These are custom profiles that I built for my camera sensor and lens. So I could go to these, and because it'd probably be more accurate on color because they match my sensor. Most of the time I don't go to these unless I'm really interested in color, because I do enjoy, again, the Adobe Color, landscape in this case. It would work well. Then we have some artistic ones. We have different black and white, modern, vintage. I'll let you peruse through these. And then I've made some really wild ones as well. So these are user profiles, and like I said, I generated these while I was playing. Not sure what I was smoking, but you are able to do those as well. Excuse me. I'm going to click on close. So you should pick your color profile before you do anything else. That's why it's at the very top of the list. Adobe recommends that you start at the top and work your way down. I find myself not doing that most of the time, every once in a while, because exposure is pretty rough in terms of how it opens and darkens. So my tendency is to think that the camera does a good job with those the overall base exposure, and I don't want to blow out these the sky, because if you recall, we have this red portion blown out already. So I don't really want to brighten the image on the overall. In fact, I'll leave that on. And because I have a slider called shadows, and it's right down here, and if I slide the shadows, I can open up that all the detail in the bridge. Now this works globally, so it's lightening everything that's fairly dark, but it tries to keep the whites alone. As you can see, I have not added any more of the red to uh, to the sky where we see that it's being clipped. If I come to highlights, I can darken down the highlights a little bit and get rid of that red, just like that. So now it's gone. Well, not all the way. I can bring it back a little bit more. Okay, so the highlights controls the highlights, and I prefer this anyway because I'm starting to get better definition on the clouds. And on the shadows, I can brighten them up. So if I turn these back on, I still have the blue, um, but I can also slide my black slider over, which is down at the bottom, and take that out. So even though those blacks were plugged and the whites were clipped, now I've dramatically changed the image just with those three sliders and not touching the exposure, which would really blow out the whites more in order to brighten up the bridge. So let's talk about the, that's how I would approach this image. Um, as shot, white balance we have, since it's a raw file, we had access to these. If you shot JPEG, you can't change the white balance like this. You have to do it by eye or with the eyedropper. So I could say, well, it's a shady day, so I want to warm it up some. Tungsten, I add a lot of blue, fluorescent, etc., etc. Here's a flash, and I'll leave it as shot for right now. If I grab this eyedropper here, and the keyboard shortcut is W, but watch the navigator. Watch the navigator over here. So when I'm over here, the navigator shows me what it would look like if I were to click right there. The target that following the eyedropper tries to give a tone that it is, but the navigator tries to show us what would happen if I were to click here. So if I were to click on green, you can see it adds magenta, which is the opposite color. So I kind of like looking at that. That kind of warms it up. So if I wanted more of a sunset time, which is what it is, then I could go with that. If I tap Command Z, then that backspace is in the history one slap. And if I do it again, it keeps backstepping if you're noticing the history state. So Command Z can continue to undo. If I click down here and then make a change, what happens to the history? All of that previous stuff went away and it started at the top with my latest change. So the history is good. I'm gonna double click on exposure and gonna continue going with this. So white balance is important because that sets your colors from the very beginning. And we can change what's called temp. temperature and tint. As you can see, it's blue to yellow on the temperature and green to magenta on the tint. So if I wanted to do these by hand, then I could add a little bit of yellow to warm it up. If I did too much, you can see what it looks like there. And if I add magenta as well, those two in combination make red. So this way I could hand or eye alter everything that's coming through there. So I'm going to click back down, and I'm going to come back with open my, so exposure is just that. It's a darkening and lightening of all the tones. And it does it really quite fast. Contrast, we'll look at changing um, how many tones are between black and white. So to the right, it minimizes the number of tones. As you can see, it's more black and white rather than gray. Here, it's all gray with no black and no white when I slide it all the way to the left. So contrast uh, will also change color. If you notice as I go to the right, see how much more vivid the colors come in, saturated, and how much more dull and the colors are without much saturation at all. That's part of the reason why I don't like using contrast. I use contrast in different ways, or build contrast in different ways. Highlights are just that, everything but not the pure whites. And you can see it tries to hold them. It tries not to clip them, but it does. You know, I can bring it all the way to the right to bring down the highlights. I must reset each one by double clicking on the word. Down the ladder, there's whites. So that's just the purest whites. And you can see it really blows out and clips all of them. And so this is affecting the pure white values, and highlights is everything except the pure white, you know, the brighter tones. And it tries not to clip. Shadows is the same as just the opposite of highlights. So it's going to be the darker tones, not including black. As you can see, that doesn't necessarily add all the plugging that the blacks will when I show you, but it is affecting them. And then all the way to the right brightens up my highlights, or sorry, my shadows. Again, it tries to work without plugging, and it stays out of the um, brighter tones is what I'm trying to say. And if you're looking up at the histogram, you can see the area where it's being where it affects us. Then skipping down to black, I can really make blacks plug just like what the whites did with the clouds, and I can slide it all the way to the right, so I have zero black anywhere. Now, traditionally, photographically, if we have a pure black and a pure white, then all the other tones in between have something to key off of so that they're better defined. So it's okay to have a pure black. It's okay to have a pure white. It's just how much and where and the size. Because if we don't want it on our main subject, especially if it's a face and they have been outside and they got a little perspiration going, and you take a picture of them, and it's just really bright on the skin tones for the highlights. Coming down into presence, right down here. Hopefully you saw the green circle. Clarity. Clarity is a cool slider. I do use clarity. Um, when you slide it to the right, it crispens up the mid-tone contrast, the edges of the mid-tone contrast. So as you can see, and here, going to the left, it softens the edges of mid-tone contrast. So it kind of looks like a blur coming in, kind of foggy. So, but it also is changing contrast, like I said. So it's mid-tone contrast, but it does quite a bit of work in there. And if you notice, it also brightened up my shadows, brightened up some of my real bright highlights. Not much, but some. It added a little bit of plugging to some more shadows, so it's not affecting too much the whites and bright whites and the blacks and the real darks. It's the midtones. That's what clarity does. Dehaze I'll also use sparingly, but it really works in a very rigorous fashion. If you notice, it's increasing contrast, it's increasing saturation, it's increasing blacks, it's increasing whites. So it was originally designed to remove atmospheric haze from landscapes. Here it puts it back in. And so we can create a true fog with dehaze and then with clarity all the way to the minus. Looks like you're looking through the bottom of a Coke bottle. So if I reset those, so the dehaze I find interesting as an artistic approach. So I use it very slowly and gently. Next down the list is vibrance. Vibrance is a saturation tool that looks first for the undersaturated colors while trying to ignore skin tone. So it looks for undersaturated colors, so it doesn't want to oversaturate the very saturated colors. So looking for the undersaturated colors while trying to ignore skin tone. So it will affect skin tone, but it tries to ignore it. So if you go too far to the right, it's going to affect skin tone. Just be aware of that. I do use vibrance gently. Um, Saturation, I rarely use here because it's just too much. It saturates everything globally. Even the oversaturated colors will be even more oversaturated. This image isn't that bad at this beginning stage. So those are the sliders and what they do. As you can see, I've been playing and playing and playing and showing you. So I'll click all the way back at the bottom to keep going here. So as I said, for this particular image, I would open the shadows, but I'd look to see what's going on everywhere else, because there's other options that's going to be coming up in additional tutorials where we're using our brush and our gradient and using those to affect localized. This is global. This is all the global effects. This is what you want to do first. So that way it reveals what you can do on a local basis. I'm going to bring the blacks down just a hair. And I opened up, because I opened up the shadows. So I want to maintain some of that. And I kind of like the feel of that right there. Highlights, I do want all the way to the left, a little bit more dramatic sky. I'm going to add a touch of clarity as well. I'm going to leave dehaze alone. I'll probably bring up vibrance just a little bit to add some color in there. And this is where I would probably stop for the global adjustments for this particular image. And I do like what I'm seeing. And coming back with that, one more thing for this tutorial, right underneath the basic is a tone curve. And this is another way of controlling the image. I can give it, some people say start with a slight amount of S curve. So I just pulled the bottom portion down a little bit and the top portion up a little bit, which gives it a very slight S curve look. You can you can be very dramatic on it, and if the sliders up above don't do enough, then you can really go to town with this one. And here's a nearly pure black, pure white image, and this is one of the few ways that you could really get that without a preset. But of course, we don't want to do that. So I am going to reset this, and just by, oops, maybe not just by. I'm gonna go to a linear curve, so that just turns that off. And so right here is where I went. So a tone curve is really good at times because sometimes you can't get quite enough out of the basic section, so you come down to the tone curve and work with it in here additionally. While I'm looking at the tabs, for me personally, I create a different order. This is the default order. If I right click on one of them, I can go to Customize Develop Panel. And this way I can come in and say, or reorder them completely. I don't use the tone curve all that much, so I'm going to click and drag it down to near the bottom. I definitely don't use split toning, so now I have calibration, split tone from the bottom up. Effects is good. Lens correction is what I'll put in as number 3 because I use HSL to control my colors. Actually, I'll put, trying to remember now that I'm talking about it. And we're going to put detail down here. So now I kind of have them in order of the way I'm going to work the image. And so I'm going to leave it here. Yeah, I'm going to leave it just like this. So it's basic, lens correction, transformation, HSL, effects, detail, tone curve, split toning, and calibration. So this way, and it's going to say, well, you have to relaunch it. And I'll say launch later. So, but that's how I tend to order because I order them based on how I work on the file. Okay, so that's all for the basic tab.